Hey guys, it's Brian here. The Rim to Rim pack is now available and the reviews are starting to come in. We're hearing a lot about how comfortable the pack is, how it feels like it's part of you, how high the quality of materials and workmanship are. And of course, folks, just pure joy over having front pockets and being able to keep the essentials accessible so you don't have to take the pack off. The Rim to Rim pack is a 22-liter day pack designed through my hundreds of miles below the rim and engineered to survive the toughest day hikes on Earth. If you're in the market for a new pack, we would love if you would check it out. Its sales do support this show. That's at brightangeloutfitters.com. At Bright Angel Outfitters, we do it all for the love of the canyon and to help you have your best possible experience below the rim. Find the Rim to Rim pack as well as a ton of free content like our Beginner's Guide to Rim ebook and the Grand Canyon Shade Tracker exclusively at brightangeloutfitters.com. Now, on to the show. Hey everybody, my name is Brian Special, and this is the Grand Canyon Hiker Dude Show presented by Bright Angel Outfitters. Today, a tragic tale that left everyone involved shaking their heads and wondering how something like this could ever happen. This story will show you how key preparation is when planning a Grand Canyon adventure, and that the details most certainly matter. It'll show you how important it is to choose the proper time of year and time of day before dropping into the canyon, and it will show you how fragile life really is, and how no matter how good a shape you're in, the canyon can kill. Much of what you're about to hear was influenced by an article written by Christopher Reynolds in the LA Times and from an excerpt in Over the Edge, Death in Grand Canyon by Michael Ghiglieri and Dr. Tom Myers. Dr. Myers, in fact, will join me to help tell this story. Now, the tragic, confounding, but valuable tale of Margaret Bradley on the Grand Canyon Hiker Dude Show presented by Bright Angel Outfitters. April 2004. The U.S. is at war in Afghanistan. Saddam Hussein is about to go on trial in Iraq. But for Margaret Bradley, those are just events in faraway places. At 24, Margaret is on top of the world. A first-year medical student in Chicago, already with degrees in biology and earth science. A violinist, and passionate above all else about running. She was an All-American at the University of Chicago and has just run the prestigious Boston Marathon in just over 3 hours on a sweltering 85-degree day that saw more than 1,100 runners treated for heat-related issues. When asked afterwards how she'd performed so well in such tough conditions, Margaret told a local magazine that she'd focused on keeping herself hydrated and not letting the adrenaline from the crowd make her do something stupid. Fast forward 2.5 months. It's July 8th, 2004. Summer at Grand Canyon, the most inhospitable time of year. A time when most experienced canyon hikers or runners will either stay off the trails or at least have a proper plan and supplies to make heat mitigation their number one priority. This is the time of year when unprepared hikers and runners die below the rim. In spite of the warnings, it happens every year. Yet here are Margaret Bradley and her new running buddy, Ryan, who she shared a Chicago connection with and who had recently moved to nearby Flagstaff. Ryan, with at least some canyon experience, had planned their route. Margaret, heading below the rim for the first time, was following his lead. The two were likely feeling the excitement and adrenaline that most do as they lay eyes on the canyon before taking it on. At around 9 that morning, the temperature is rising as the two drop in at the Grandview trailhead. Their plan is to descend more than 3,000 vertical feet on Grandview to the canyon's Tonto platform, a desolate, desert-like landscape where they'd connect with the relatively level Tonto Trail, which they'd then follow west to the tip-off on the heavily trafficked South Kaibab Trail. At that point, they'd turn uphill and make the final 4.5-mile climb with 3,200 feet of elevation gain to their finish at the South Rim. But there were many problems with this plan, all which could have been prevented with proper research, or even a basic understanding of the extreme conditions Margaret and Ryan would no doubt face. The first issue was that Ryan had somehow estimated the length of the run at about 15 miles, when in reality, it was almost twice that, 28.7, longer than a full marathon, on a scorching July day, in an environment far more brutal and unforgiving and unrelenting than any marathon course on the planet. Dr. Tom Myers has practiced at the Grand Canyon Clinic for more than 30 years and is the co-author of the popular book Over the Edge, Death in Grand Canyon.
Margaret put her faith in her hiking companion, and unfortunately he was not that experienced and gave her poor advice.
Making an already dangerous plan far worse was the duo's start time, 9 a.m., at least 5 hours too late for such an itinerary. They also didn't pack any of the just-in-case essentials like headlamps or a sat phone or even a map. But worst of all, their paltry supply of water. Ryan carried 4 liters, Margaret less than 2.
Neither of them brought enough water for what they were attempting to do. Even if it was the miles that he had initially said, they still should have had a lot more water in that just to have a little bit of a safety net.
But down they went, unknowingly unprepared for what lay ahead. Margaret Bradley and her friend Ryan, youthfully exuberant, confident, ready to conquer anything the canyon could throw at them. But with the sun getting higher and higher in the sky and ruthlessly beating down on them, they wouldn't even be to their halfway point before all of their water was gone. How quickly do you think they knew that they were in trouble?
I'm going to guess probably within 3-4 hours.
Should they have turned around at that point?
Yeah, I think so.
But remember, Margaret and Ryan were planning for a 15-mile day. At the very least, they had to figure they would be coming up on South Kaibab at any moment. Even there, they would find no water, but they could at least call for help and probably access an emergency supply at the tip-off. But Ryan was already in bad shape. At the 15-mile point, he felt on the verge of heat stroke. So Ryan curled up in a patch of shade. He and Margaret would rest here for 2.5 hours. Margaret, perhaps even more dehydrated than Ryan, faced a decision.
The hours ticked away and the miles ticked away, and she realized they're not any closer. It was dawning on her that, oh crap, now I'm in a fight for my life. I can't even imagine what went through her mind. Absolute sheer terror. Like, I got to get out of here. I'm going to die. This is legit. This is it. My life's in the balance.
That tonneau platform is no place to be in the summertime. If people aren't aware, it's very, very, very exposed. They were in the worst place just about that they could be in the canyon, weren't they?
They were. Yeah, it was just unrelenting. The solar load, the no shade. But it had her companion done his homework, they definitely wouldn't have been in that predicament to begin with.
So they know they're in trouble. They hunker down. They try to get a little piece of shade. Ryan's the one who's really struggling the most. So what do you think is going through both of their minds at this point?
I think Ryan at that point was betting on Margaret and her level of fitness, her stoicism, her ability to push through pain and fatigue as a runner to rescue them both. And then Margaret, I think, I'm going to bet she was angry and very concerned and, obviously super stressed, pegging the stress meter, like, got to get out of here, and not knowing exactly how to do it and where the next water would be found.
At this point, it's not just dehydration that's setting in. So too is desperation. Margaret decides to leave Ryan. Her plan is to reach South Kaibab, which she's expecting at any moment. And instead of turn uphill toward the rim, turn downhill and make a 2.5-mile run to the river and Phantom Ranch for help. Was it a huge mistake for them to split up? Should they have stayed together?
Yeah, that's a good question, Brian. I think the question would be the level of dehydration that Margaret had. So I think Margaret probably felt a sense of urgency and thirst that may have exceeded his in a sense of panic. I think the level, what happens with thirst, I liken it to having your head held underwater and that panic to get air. It's the same sort of panic, but it slowly builds up. It's like that desperation, to get water, and it gets where it's pure torture. I got to get to water, and so it ramps up. And Margaret may have been at a point where she said, "No, I can't even stay here. I need water now. My body's telling me I need water now." And then, unfortunately, being as physically fit as she was and used to pushing herself, she may have just said, "I'm going to choose to just get out of here and just take my chances." And if Ryan was correct, I should be finding the South Kaibab Trail soon. Get to help.
So off she went. Imagine the frustration of thinking your destination, the South Kaibab Trail, is just around the next bend, over and over. Fear, panic, desperation, on top of dehydration. That can be a lethal cocktail. And Margaret, perhaps wondering at this point if South Kaibab even exists, makes the decision to veer off trail. You see this time and again, it seems like, with situations like this, where, and this is pointed out in your book numerous times, where someone is presenting heat stroke-related symptoms, and next thing you know, they're dropping their pack, they're going off trail, and they're trying to make a beeline for water. In this case, on the tonneau platform, you might think, if you're not experiencing the canyon, well, there must be a shorter way to get to the river, because that's, I think, what everyone wants to do. I want to get to the river. I need to get to water. And so they make what ultimately becomes a fatal mistake by going off trail and trying to take a shortcut to the river.
Yeah, a lot of those decisions like that, when they're in the throes of sheer panic, like I have to get to water now, that people will do things that risk serious injury, fatal injury, because they're so desperate, like these impossible down climbs, or trying to tear a cactus open with their bare hands, or maybe drinking their own urine, just things that to just alleviate the thirst. There's stories where historically people drink blood, you name it, antifreeze, anything to try to seawater, things to try to quench thirst. It's that powerful of a symptom or stimulus for people. And then the further they get into the heat stroke, then especially if they're becoming altered, then the judgment just tanks.
There's no doubt that's what she was doing, right?
No doubt. Yeah, she was in the thick of it, and desperate and in panic, and she knows her life is now extremely high risk. Her life is in the balance. And
so in Grand Canyon, when that happens, and when you do go off trail and you think there's a shorter way to the water, what can happen to you?
They'll go down these steep slot. Most of the Grand Canyon eventually have narrows and big cliffs and pour-overs. It's hard rock, and so what happens is they'll down climb a cliff, or even jump, down a section that they know they probably couldn't get back up. And then they keep going, and unfortunately they encounter a cliff that may be even worse, that they can't down climb. And so they're trapped between a cliff that they can't down climb and the one they went down and they can't get back up. And at that point, you're done. Unless somebody finds you.
While all this is happening, Ryan is feeling well enough to continue his trudge towards South Kaibab. But after 3 miles of hiking, and now in total darkness, he stops and sleeps on the trail. As dawn breaks, he continues, and within an hour, he finally connects with South Kaibab. Not long after, a USGS worker on her way up from Phantom Ranch meets up with Ryan. She accesses an emergency supply of water. Ryan drinks 2 liters, rests for a while, and then, with the same worker who hadn't left his side, begins the long climb up South Kaibab. It's likely that Margaret is still alive and in grave danger. But Ryan, for reasons that might never be known, never mentions her to the USGS worker. A ranger at Phantom, who had been discussing the situation with that worker by satellite phone, would later say, quote, "Nowhere in that conversation did we get the information that he was a runner, that he'd crossed the Tonto, or that there were two of them." Ryan had apparently believed that Margaret had made it to Phantom. On his way up, he'd even given a message to a guide headed down. Quote, "Ask the ranger to try to get a message to a woman I was hiking with. Tell the ranger to tell her I'm moving her car from Grandview to the South Kaibab trailhead area. Her name is Margaret Bradley." After surfacing at South Kaibab 12 hours after being found, Ryan changed plans, and instead of moving Margaret's car, he asked the USGS worker to drive him home to Flagstaff, about an hour and a half's drive, which she did. At around 11 that night, 16 hours after Ryan had been found, Margaret Bradley's family called police to report her missing. Early the next morning, 24 hours now after he'd been found and 40 since he and Margaret had separated on Tonto, Ryan finally told police and park rangers what had happened to he and Margaret. As a ranger would later say, suddenly, all the dots connected. A search was immediately launched, and by noon, several hundred yards south of the Tonto Trail, trapped in a drainage, a rescue helicopter spotted Margaret Bradley. She was curled up in the fetal position, with her head resting on her fanny pack. But there was no movement. Margaret was gone. The medical examiner would determine that Margaret had died of dehydration roughly 12 to 24 hours prior. Ryan had met up with the USGS worker at the tip-off 30 hours before Margaret was found. She had likely been alive for between 7 and 19 hours after Ryan had found help. When I'm reading this part of the book, I can almost read between the lines of what you and Michael are writing, and you can almost feel the seething anger at what you're writing.
You know, it was one of those situations where you think it was so easily preventable, and here Margaret was trusted her friend and put her faith in that he was advising her correctly and that this was going to be a great hike and fun and all that stuff. And then she risks her life. She goes off to try to save him. And then the irony is that she's probably still alive, and it doesn't dawn on him that the first thing he should have done was say, "Hey, where's Margaret? You know, I got my friend. I want to find out if she's, how she's doing. Is she safe? Is she in distress herself?" And so that irony, we were struck by the incredible irony there that Margaret lost her life, pushing herself, pushing. A woman who was a phenomenal athlete, pushed herself to her death basically to try to save them both, and he didn't have the same regard, I guess. I mean, the fact that he didn't have the same regard for her life that she seemed to have for his is just incredibly sad and incredibly ironic and anger-provoking. It's like, if you were Margaret's parents, you're like, oh my God, how could you not? How could you not? The first thing that popped in your mind is my friend, who, her well-being. I think most
How does that happen?
How does that happen?
How does that happen?
I don't know. Maybe he was not completely in his defense. I mean, he'd come through this horrible thing. Maybe he's still kind of out of it because of his own experience, dehydration, and who knows. But it just seems like there's something wrong with the thought process there, for sure, that he didn't consider her well-being right at the very beginning. When he got to the Kaibab.
Then for hours after.
And hours afterward, it's like it just goes on, and so as Michael and I worked on that story and learned more about it and learned how the Rangers felt and what was going on, it's like all of us, everybody, that was even remotely familiar with it, were like, you got to be kidding me. This is so horribly tragic, and could have ended differently. And the torture she went through those last few hours must have just been absolutely brutal.
It's been 20 years now since Margaret's passing. She'd be 44 this year, in the prime of life. Instead, her story is a tragic but important reminder of the many entirely preventable dangers one can face in the Grand Canyon. What ultimately can be learned from the Margaret Bradley story?
Well, Margaret, again, great runner, probably run you and I into the dirt. I mean, she was a serious kick-butt athlete, and I think part of the thing with that, it can be a blessing and a curse that you can overestimate your ability, and there may have been some of that. It's like, it's only that far? Psh, that's a training run for me, and then I don't know what Margaret's mindset was, but maybe she, like most of us, especially an athlete, they can overestimate their ability and underestimate the Grand Canyon, and they underestimate that heat. And then she also put her faith in somebody who, rather than maybe doing her own homework and researching it, she put her faith in a guy who led her down in the ultimate way, cost her life. And so lessons learned would be, do your own homework. Don't put the burden on all this to yourself. Get How Not to Die, maybe. Read it and understand the risks. And then maybe if you do have a companion who has this itinerary that might be a little bit over the top, you can, challenge him and say, I don't know, maybe this is not such a good idea this time of year. It's like, and if we run out of water, where are we going to find more? Or what are our options, depending on if we have some unforeseen thing happen. So do your home. It's front end loaded in so many ways. Do your homework, be prepared, and definitely don't underestimate the Grand Canyon.
The tragic tale of Margaret Bradley. It was actually emotional to write that one. It'll really make you think about a lot of things, but especially how preventable it was from beginning to end. For a time after Margaret's death, the Park Service actually used photos of her on signs around the rim, touting her Boston Marathon experience and warning hikers that if it can happen to someone like Margaret, it can surely happen to them. Thanks as always to Dr. Tom Myers, the Canyon Doc, for his help in telling Margaret's story. Well, folks, it is summertime at the Canyon, and we invested in the Grand Canyon Shade Tracker because we believe so strongly that it can help prevent stories like Margaret's. Look, we get it. Summer is when people are on vacation and off work. It's the only time a lot of people have to get to the canyon, so you're never going to stop people from doing it. So at least use the Shade Tracker if you're going to be in the canyon in the summertime. It lets you plan your route for times of day when you're guaranteed to have shade, which can really make all the difference. You'll find the Shade Tracker at brightangeloutfitters.com. It'll show you the shade on every trail, right down to the minute, every day of the year. It's completely free to use. Again, the Grand Canyon Shade Tracker at brightangeloutfitters.com. Okay, training tip time from Coach Arnie. This time we revisit something Coach talked about in a previous episode that I know a lot of you are doing: walking backwards.
Hey everybody, this is Coach Arnie with the Grand Canyon Training Tip of the Week. And thank you again, Brian, for allowing me to share some wisdom and knowledge of the canyon with your wonderful audience. Today's tip, I want to share something that I had already talked about on an episode of Grand Canyon Hiker Dude, walking backwards. Why? Because walking backwards is a secret weapon. Another one, it is the cornerstone of what my canyon training program is all about. I first came across it many years ago because as an exercise physiologist, I'm in the rehab business, and we would use walking backwards as a rehab exercise for improving ACL or hamstring injuries, and it just worked. I thought, well, wait a minute. I, who was just getting into ultra running, wanted to get better at running downhill. And I thought to myself, well, well, wait a minute. Walking backwards works the hamstrings, works the hips, which would protect my knees. I thought, well, here we go. Because I was dealing with my own knee issues, my own hamstring issues. And could I shorten up the learning curve to get better at downhills, besides just running a bunch of downhills, as I was being told, by walking backwards? And you know what? I thought about it. I broke it down. The exercise, the muscles were the same. I thought, well, why not? So by just starting off by walking flat, literally flat on the ground for 10 minutes, you could get going. And then if you had a treadmill, you could literally turn the power off on the treadmill, what I call a dead mill, and walk on it with no power, pushing along. You could change the angle if you wanted to. If you had access to a weighted sled, you could add weight and resistance. You could add time. You could add distance. Whatever you wanted to do, you had all these variables that allowed you to work the same muscles that you would be doing on a downhill, and you could do it at your convenience at your facility where you're at. It worked, and it will work for you, I promise you. Just give it a try. Just start with 10 minutes. You'll be surprised. I love you guys. And remember, if you have any questions, you can always message me from Pain Free Arnie on Instagram, or you can call or text me at 602-390-9144. Love you. Talk to you later.
If you missed it, we'll put Coach Arnie's number in the show notes. Who the heck makes that offer in this day and age, right? Believe me, it is because Coach Arnie really does care. Well, that's it for this week. My name is Brian Special, encouraging you, as always, to go hike the canyon. Take that first step. Embrace the journey. And when you get there, whether it's for time goals or taking your time, just hike your own hike. Look around and enjoy all that is the magnificence of the Grand Canyon. We'll see you next time on the Grand Canyon Hiker Dude Show, presented by Bright Angel Outfitters.